Speak and Grow Rich: How Powerful Words Build Wealth, Influence, and Success. Introduction. Close your eyes for a moment. Well, don't actually close them. You're listening to this, not reading it. But imagine, just for a second, that every word you've ever spoken left a physical mark on the world around you. Every complaint carved a small groove into the pavement beneath your feet. Every compliment planted a seed in the soil of someone's life. Every "I can't" built a wall, brick by brick, somewhere just ahead of you on the road you're walking. And every "I will" cleared a path. If that were true, if words were that visible, that permanent, that architectural, how differently would you speak? Here's the truth this book is built on. Words are that powerful. We simply can't see the walls and the paths, because they're built out of something invisible: belief, expectation, trust, fear, possibility. But invisible doesn't mean unreal. Gravity is invisible too, and you'd never argue it doesn't shape your life. Think about the people you know who seem to move through life with a kind of quiet magnetism. Doors open for them. People remember their names. Opportunities land in their laps that never seem to land in yours. It's tempting to chalk this up to luck, or connections, or timing. And sometimes it is those things. But far more often, if you listen closely, really listen, you'll notice something else. These people talk differently, not louder, not smarter necessarily, differently. They describe problems as puzzles instead of disasters. They ask questions that make other people feel important instead of interrogated. They say, "Here's what I'm going to do," instead of, "I'll try." Their language does work that their resume never could. This is not a coincidence, and it is not magic. It's a skill, and like any skill, it can be learned, practiced, and mastered by absolutely anyone willing to pay attention to it, including you. Starting right now. Most people go their entire lives treating language as an afterthought. They think carefully about their finances, their fitness, their careers, even their diets, but they let words tumble out of their mouths, unedited, unexamined, and unimproved, as if speech were just exhaust fumes from the engine of thought, rather than a tool with the power to build or destroy. This book is an invitation to stop doing that. I want to make you a promise, and then I want to explain why I can keep it. The promise is this: if you change the words you use, the words you say to yourself in the quiet of your own mind, and the words you say out loud to the people around you, your life will change. Not someday, not eventually, but starting almost immediately, in small and then increasingly large ways. Here's why I can make that promise. Words don't just describe reality, they shape it. The words you rehearse internally determine what you believe is possible for you, and belief determines what you attempt. The words you speak to others determine how much they trust you, and trust determines what they're willing to offer you: a job, a deal, a second date, a loan, a promotion, their loyalty. Every relationship you have, every dollar you earn, every door that opens or closes in your career, runs through the narrow gate of language. Learn to use that gate wisely, and very little in your life will remain unchanged. This is not a book about being clever with words for its own sake. It's not about manipulation, and it's not about sounding impressive at dinner parties. It's about something much more practical and much more valuable: learning to use language as the single most versatile tool you own, one that costs nothing to use and can be improved indefinitely, no matter your age, your background, your education, or how introverted or extroverted you happen to be. Over the chapters ahead, we're going to explore how your inner dialogue shapes your outer results, how vocabulary sharpens or muddies your thinking, how your voice can build unshakable confidence, how the right questions create influence far more reliably than the right answers, and how the language of truly successful people differs, often in small but decisive ways, from the language of people who stay stuck. We'll talk about difficult conversations, about leadership, about the specific vocabulary of wealth-minded thinking, and about how to turn ordinary conversation into extraordinary opportunity. You don't need a bigger vocabulary than everyone else. You don't need a golden voice or a natural gift for public speaking. What you need is intention, the decision to treat your words as valuable, because they are, and to start spending them the way you'd spend any other precious resource, deliberately, generously, and with an eye toward the return you want to see. Let's begin where all lasting change begins, not with what you say to others, but with what you say to yourself. Chapter 1. The Hidden Power of Words. There is a conversation happening inside you right now, and it has never stopped, not for a single day of your life. It started before you could form full sentences, and it will keep running, quietly, in the background of everything you do, until your very last breath. It's the conversation you have with yourself, and it is, without exaggeration, the most influential relationship you will ever have. Psychologists have a name for this ongoing narration: self-talk. And here's what decades of research on it keeps confirming, again and again, in study after study. The tone and content of that inner conversation shapes your stress levels, your resilience, your performance under pressure, and your willingness to take the kinds of risks that lead to growth. People aren't destined for confidence or doomed to anxiety by their genes alone. A significant part of the difference comes down to the words they habitually rehearse in their own minds. Think of your mind as a courtroom, and your inner voice as the attorney who's always speaking on your behalf, or, in far too many cases, against you. Every day, that attorney is building a case for what you can and can't do, what you deserve and don't deserve, who you are and who you're allowed to become. The tragedy is that most people let this attorney run wild without ever cross-examining a single argument. They accept, "I'm not good at this," or "I always mess things up," or "people like me don't get opportunities like that," as established fact, when in reality, it's just a phrase, one that's been repeated so often, it's calcified into identity. Here's an experiment worth trying today. For the next 24 hours, simply notice, without judgment, just notice how you talk to yourself when something goes wrong. Spill your coffee, miss a deadline, fumble a sentence in a meeting. What's the very first phrase that runs through your mind? For most people, it's something shockingly harsh. Words they would never dream of saying to a friend, a coworker, or even a stranger. We reserve our cruelest language for the one person who hears every single word we say: ourselves. This matters because the mind doesn't just record self-talk, it acts on it. Athletes have known this for generations, which is why elite performance coaches spend as much time on an athlete's internal language as they do on physical mechanics. A sprinter who thinks, "don't false start," is quietly rehearsing the word false start in vivid detail right before the gun goes off. A far more effective phrase is something concrete and forward-facing. Explode on the sound. The brain moves toward what it rehearses, not what it's told to avoid. This is why "don't think about a pink elephant" always fails. The instruction to avoid something requires you to first construct the very image you're trying to avoid. The same principle governs your career, your finances, and your relationships. If your internal script is, "I'm bad with money," you will find yourself unconsciously avoiding the very behaviors, checking your accounts, negotiating your salary, learning to invest, that would prove that script wrong. The words become a self-fulfilling prophecy, not because of some mystical force, but because of simple behavioral mechanics. We act in ways that are consistent with our self-concept, and our self-concept is built, brick by brick, out of the words we repeat about ourselves. Now here's where this gets even more interesting, and more useful. The words we speak out loud carry an even stronger effect than the words we merely think, because speech engages more of the brain, activates memory formation more powerfully, and, crucially, invites social reinforcement. When you say something out loud, especially to another person, you're far more likely to act in a way that's consistent with it. This is sometimes called the consistency principle. Human beings have a deep psychological drive to behave in ways that match what they've publicly stated, because inconsistency creates a kind of internal discomfort we instinctively want to resolve. This is a double-edged sword, and it cuts both ways with real force. Say I'm terrible at public speaking, in front of colleagues often enough, and you'll find yourself unconsciously protecting that identity, fumbling your words, avoiding eye contact, turning down opportunities to practice, because some part of you now has a reputation to maintain, even if that reputation is one you never wanted. But flip the phrase, and the same mechanism works in your favor. Say, I'm someone who's getting better at this every time I try, even if it feels like a stretch the first few times. And you give yourself psychological permission to actually improve, because now your actions have something consistent to reach toward. Consider two entrepreneurs pitching nearly identical business ideas to the same investor. The first says, I'm hoping this could maybe work, if the market cooperates. The second says, I've identified a gap, and I'm building the solution for it. Same idea, same numbers, radically different outcomes. Because language doesn't just describe confidence, it manufactures it, both in the speaker and in everyone listening. This is the foundation everything else in this book rests on. Before you can speak persuasively to a room, a client, or a stranger at a networking event, you have to clean up the conversation you're having with the person you'll never stop talking to, yourself. The words you use internally set the ceiling for the confidence, clarity, and courage you're able to bring to every external conversation that follows. Here's a practical exercise to start with today. Take a phrase you catch yourself repeating often. Something like, I'm just not a numbers person, or I never get lucky, or I'm bad at first impressions. Write it down. Then rewrite it, not as a fantasy, but as an honest, forward-moving statement. I'm building my comfort with numbers, or I create opportunities through consistent effort, or I'm learning what makes a strong first impression. Say the new version out loud, once a day, for the next week. You're not lying to yourself. You're simply replacing a closed door with an open one, and giving your mind somewhere new to walk through. Chapter Takeaway. The conversation you have with yourself, silently and out loud, sets the boundaries of what you believe is possible. And belief is the seed every achievement grows from. Change the seed, and eventually, you change the harvest. In the next chapter, we'll take this idea a step further and look at something surprising. Your vocabulary doesn't just express your thinking, it actively shapes how clearly you're able to think in the first place. Chapter 2. Speak to think better. Here's a question that sounds strange until you sit with it. Have you ever had a feeling you couldn't name? Maybe it was a knot in your stomach before a decision, a low hum of dissatisfaction with a job that looked perfect on paper, or a flicker of excitement about an idea you couldn't quite articulate. Until you found the right words for it, that feeling probably felt like fog, present, real, but impossible to work with. And then, at some point, you found the words. Maybe you called it burnout, instead of just tiredness. Maybe you called it scope creep, instead of just, this project feels endless. And something shifted. The fog cleared. Suddenly, you could see the shape of the thing, and once you could see it, you could actually do something about it. This is not a coincidence. It's a documented cognitive phenomenon, and it explains why building your vocabulary isn't a vanity project for people who like crossword puzzles. It's one of the most practical investments you can make in your own thinking. Language and thought are far more intertwined than most people realize. We tend to picture thinking as something that happens first, in some wordless, pre-verbal space, and then gets translated into language when we're ready to speak. But for most complex thought, the kind involved in solving problems, making decisions, and understanding ourselves, the words aren't a translation of the thought. They're the material the thought is built out of. Try to plan a 5-year career strategy without using any words in your head, even silently. You can't. The moment you exceed thoughts as simple as, "I'm hungry," or "that's loud," you need language as scaffolding. This means that a limited vocabulary doesn't just make you a less interesting conversationalist. It puts a ceiling on the complexity of the thoughts you're capable of having. If the only words you have for a negative emotional state are bad and stressed, then every difficult feeling, grief, frustration, anxiety, jealousy, disappointment, overwhelm, gets flattened into the same generic bucket. And you can't solve a problem you can't accurately name. You end up treating grief with a strategy meant for stress, or trying to fix overwhelm with a solution meant for simple frustration, because your language hasn't given you the resolution to tell these things apart. The same principle applies directly to business and money. Someone who can only describe their financial situation as good or bad is working with a 2-bit resolution on a problem that actually requires much finer distinctions: cash flow versus net worth, fixed costs versus discretionary spending, an asset versus a liability. Once you learn these words and what they actually mean, you're not just talking about money differently, you're seeing it differently. In the same way, a colorblind person who suddenly gains the ability to see color isn't just learning new words for red and green, they're perceiving a dimension of reality that was invisible to them before. This is why voracious readers, across nearly every field of study, tend to demonstrate stronger problem-solving skills, not because reading is some magical brain exercise, but because reading is the most efficient way to accumulate the raw vocabulary that complex thought requires. Every new precise word you learn is a new tool in your mental workshop. A carpenter with only a hammer can only think in terms of nails. A carpenter with a full toolbox can think in terms of joints, tension, load-bearing weight, and grain, because they have the words, and therefore the concepts, to work with. There's a second layer to this, beyond raw vocabulary. The discipline of organizing your thoughts into clear language, out loud, forces a kind of intellectual honesty that thinking alone rarely achieves. Anyone who has ever tried to explain a brilliant idea out loud, only to hear it fall apart the moment it left their mouth, knows this feeling intimately. The idea felt complete inside the fog of unspoken thought. The moment it had to survive contact with actual sentences, its gaps became obvious. This isn't a failure of the idea, it's language doing its job, acting as a filter that separates real understanding from the comfortable illusion of understanding. This is precisely why the most effective leaders, founders, and thinkers make a habit of explaining their ideas out loud, to a colleague, a mentor, even a rubber duck on their desk, a trick borrowed from software engineers who talk through buggy code line by line to a small rubber duck sitting beside their keyboard. Because the act of verbalizing the problem, out loud, in plain language, frequently reveals the solution before anyone else even responds. So how do you put this to work? Start with a simple daily habit, the 90-second explanation. Pick one idea, problem, or decision you're working through, and explain it out loud, alone in your car, in the shower, into a voice memo. It doesn't matter. In 90 seconds or less, using the simplest possible words, as if you were explaining it to a bright 12-year-old. This single exercise, done consistently, will do more for your clarity of thought than almost anything else in this book. Second, build what I call a precision list. Once a week, identify one vague word you've been leaning on too heavily: stuff, stressed, busy, fine, and replace it, in your own vocabulary, with 3 more precise alternatives: Instead of, I'm busy, try distinguishing between, I'm overcommitted, I'm deeply focused, or, I'm avoiding something harder. Each of these tells a different story, points to a different solution, and reveals a different truth about what's actually happening. Third, practice writing before you speak on anything important. A single paragraph, even 3 sentences, forces the kind of organization that rambling thought never achieves on its own. Many of the sharpest communicators you'll ever meet are not naturally gifted talkers. They are people who write first, even briefly, and speak second. Your vocabulary is not decoration. It's the resolution of your thinking. Sharpen it, and everything downstream, your decisions, your confidence, your ability to solve problems, gets sharper too. Chapter takeaway. You cannot think more clearly than your vocabulary allows. Expand your words, and you expand the ceiling of your thoughts, your decisions, and your solutions. Now that we've built the foundation of clear internal thought, it's time to turn our attention outward, to the way your voice, your tone, and your delivery either project confidence or quietly undermine it, often without you even realizing it's happening. Chapter 3. Confidence begins with your voice. Picture 2 people answering the exact same question in a job interview. Why should we hire you for this role? The first says, well, I think I could maybe be a good fit, I guess. I mean, I don't have a ton of experience in this exact area, but I'm a pretty fast learner, so hopefully that counts for something. The second says, because I've spent the last 3 years solving exactly this kind of problem, and I bring a track record of doing it well. Strip away everything else, appearance, resume, tone of voice, and just look at the words on the page. Which candidate do you trust more? Which one would you bet on? The content of both answers might be roughly equal in substance, but the language of the first candidate is doing something quietly devastating. It's apologizing for existing before anyone has even asked it to. This is what I call weak language, and almost everyone uses more of it than they realize. Weak language is made up of small, seemingly harmless words and phrases that act like tiny leaks in a boat, individually insignificant, collectively enough to sink you. I think, sort of, just, maybe, I guess. Does that make sense? Tacked onto the end of a perfectly clear sentence. These phrases hedge your own authority before anyone else has had the chance to challenge it. Here's the exercise I want you to try, starting today. For 1 full week, simply notice every time one of these qualifiers leaves your mouth. Don't even try to stop yourself yet, just notice. Most people are stunned by how often it happens. I just wanted to check. I sort of feel like this might be a bad idea, but once you can see it, you can start editing it. Not by becoming arrogant or aggressive, but by simply saying what you mean, directly, and trusting that clarity is not the same thing as rudeness. There's a particular phrase worth retiring immediately. Does that make sense? Tacked onto the end of a clear explanation. It's meant to sound considerate, but it often does the opposite. It silently suggests that you doubt your own clarity, inviting the listener to doubt it too. A far stronger habit is simply pausing after you finish speaking and trusting the silence. If clarification is genuinely needed, the other person will ask. Confidence in speech isn't about volume, and it isn't about never having doubts. Even the most accomplished communicators feel uncertain plenty of the time. The difference is that they've learned not to broadcast every flicker of internal doubt directly into their sentences. There's a useful distinction here between having doubt and speaking doubt. You are allowed to feel unsure. You are not obligated to announce it in every other sentence. Now let's talk about the body, because your voice doesn't operate independently of it. Vocal confidence is deeply physical. When we're anxious, our breath becomes shallow and high in the chest, which makes our voice rise in pitch and thin out. A sound that, whether we intend it or not, reads to listeners as uncertain or even childlike. The fix is almost embarrassingly simple. Before any conversation that matters, take 3 slow breaths that reach all the way down into your diaphragm, the way singers and actors are trained to breathe. This single physical adjustment lowers your pitch slightly, steadies your pacing, and sends a signal to your own nervous system as much as to your listener that you are not in danger. Pace matters just as much as pitch. Nervous speech tends to rush, as though the speaker is trying to get an uncomfortable moment over with as quickly as possible. Confident speech, by contrast, allows for pauses. A pause after an important statement isn't a gap to be nervously filled. It's a spotlight. It tells the listener what I just said deserves a moment to land. Watch any skilled communicator closely and you'll notice they're not afraid of a beat of silence. Silence is not empty air, it's punctuation. Then there's posture, which affects your voice more than most people realize. Speaking with your shoulders rounded forward and your chin tucked physically compresses your diaphragm, restricting the very breath your voice depends on. Simply standing or sitting upright, shoulders relaxed but open, gives your voice room to actually work. A small physical adjustment with an outsized vocal effect. Let's address fear directly, because no chapter on vocal confidence is honest without it. Public speaking anxiety is remarkably common, among the most common fears reported across large populations, right alongside things like heights and confined spaces. But here's something almost nobody tells people who struggle with it. The physical sensations of fear and the physical sensations of excitement are nearly identical. Both involve a racing heart, a surge of adrenaline, and heightened alertness. The only difference is the label your mind attaches to the sensation. Researchers have found that people who consciously relabel pre-performance nerves as "I'm excited" rather than "I'm nervous" perform measurably better because they've stopped fighting their own physiology and started using it. This is, quite literally, changing 3 words to change an outcome. Practical exercise. Before your next high-stakes conversation, a presentation, an interview, a difficult phone call, say out loud, even just to yourself, "I'm excited for this," and notice how quickly your body starts to believe you. One final piece. Recording yourself. Almost nobody enjoys hearing their own voice played back, and that's exactly why it's valuable. Record a 2-minute explanation of anything, a work project, a hobby, an opinion, once a week, and listen back critically but kindly. You will hear your own filler words, your own weak qualifiers, your own pacing habits far more clearly than you ever could in the moment of speaking. This single habit, uncomfortable as it is, accelerates vocal confidence faster than almost any other exercise available to you. Chapter takeaway. Confidence is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to speak clearly and directly in spite of it. Your breath, your pace, and your willingness to drop the qualifiers do more for your credibility than any amount of natural talent. Once you can speak with clarity and confidence, the next skill becomes possible. Using that voice not just to express yourself, but to genuinely move other people, ethically, respectfully, and effectively. That's where we're headed next. Chapter 4. The Language of Influence. Let's clear something up immediately, because the word influence makes a lot of people uncomfortable. This chapter is not about manipulation. Manipulation gets someone to do something that benefits you at their expense, often through deception. Influence, done ethically, gets someone to see a genuine opportunity or truth more clearly than they could before, something that benefits them as much as it benefits you, if not more. The line between the two isn't about technique, it's about intent and honesty. Everything in this chapter assumes you're operating on the right side of that line. With that settled, here's the single most important truth about influence. It is built almost entirely on trust, and trust is built almost entirely through language, long before it's built through action. Think about how quickly you can sense, within the first 30 seconds of a conversation, whether someone is fully present with you or simply waiting for their turn to talk. That instinct is remarkably accurate, and it's driven by specific, learnable patterns in how people speak and listen. The foundation of influential language is something almost embarrassingly simple, and yet almost nobody does it well: genuine listening. Not the kind of listening where you're nodding along while quietly rehearsing your next point. Real listening, the kind that builds trust, requires you to temporarily set aside your own agenda and become curious about the other person's actual meaning, including the parts they haven't said out loud yet. Here's a distinction worth internalizing. There's a difference between listening to respond and listening to understand. Listening to respond is scanning someone's words for the first opening to insert your own point. Listening to understand is following their logic all the way through, even the parts you disagree with, until you could accurately restate their position back to them in a way they'd recognize as fair. The second kind is rarer, and it is disproportionately persuasive, because people are far more open to being influenced by someone who has clearly demonstrated they understand where the other person is coming from first. This leads directly into one of the most underrated tools in the entire language of influence: the quality of your questions. Most people, in conversation, default to questions that are really just statements in disguise. "Don't you think we should go with option A?" is not a question, it's a demand wearing a question mark. Genuinely open questions do something very different. What would need to be true for option A to be the right call? Invites actual thinking rather than agreement or defensiveness. Consider the difference between a salesperson who asks, "Do you want to buy this?" and one who asks, "What's the biggest challenge you're hoping to solve this year?" The first question puts the other person on the defensive, forcing an immediate yes or no decision under mild social pressure. The second question does something far more powerful. It invites the other person to think out loud, to articulate their own need in their own words. And here's the psychological trick worth understanding. People trust conclusions they arrive at themselves far more than conclusions someone else hands to them. The best communicators aren't the ones who argue the most persuasively. They're the ones who ask questions precise enough that the other person persuades themselves. This connects to something called emotional intelligence, which sounds abstract until you break it into something concrete. The ability to accurately read what someone else is feeling and to respond to that feeling before responding to their words. Most disagreements aren't actually about the surface-level content people are arguing over. They're about an unspoken feeling underneath it. A coworker who's arguing fiercely about a minor scheduling detail is often not really upset about the schedule. They might be feeling unheard on a string of decisions that came before it. Someone with strong emotional intelligence learns to notice this and address the feeling directly. It sounds like you've felt left out of some of these calls lately, often diffusing an entire conflict that a purely logical argument would have only escalated. There's a simple, repeatable structure worth learning here, useful in negotiations, difficult conversations, and everyday persuasion alike. First, acknowledge before you argue. Before presenting your own view, state the other person's position back to them clearly enough that they'd agree you've understood it. This single move, which costs you nothing and takes 15 seconds, dramatically lowers defensiveness, because people stop feeling like they need to fight to be heard once they already feel heard. Second, ask before you tell. Rather than immediately presenting your solution, ask a question that leads toward it. Third, offer. Don't insist. Frame your suggestion as an option to consider rather than a verdict to accept. One thing worth considering is, rather than, "you need to." None of this requires you to abandon your own point of view or to be endlessly agreeable. Ethical influence isn't about being a pushover, it's about being persuasive without being coercive, which, counterintuitively, tends to be far more effective in the long run Because people remember how a conversation made them feel long after they've forgotten the specific words that were used. Here's a practical exercise for this week. In your next 3 conversations that matter, a work discussion, a negotiation, even a disagreement with a friend or partner, commit to asking at least 2 genuine, open-ended questions before you offer your own opinion. Notice what changes. Notice how much more the other person opens up. Notice how much more receptive they become to your perspective once they feel you've genuinely considered theirs. Chapter takeaway. Influence isn't built through clever arguments. It's built through trust. And trust is built through listening more than talking, and asking more than telling. The most persuasive people in any room are rarely the loudest. Now that we understand how words build trust and move people, let's look at exactly how that translates into something very concrete. Real opportunities, jobs, deals, partnerships, and income that show up specifically because of how you speak. Chapter 5. Words that create opportunity. Somewhere out there, right now, there's a version of your career, your income, or your business that's one conversation away from existing, and it's not going to be unlocked by luck. It's going to be unlocked, if it ever is, by specific words, spoken at a specific moment, to a specific person. This chapter is about making sure you're ready when that moment arrives, and about actively creating more of those moments in the first place. Let's start with networking, a word that makes a lot of people wince because it conjures images of forced small talk and business cards exchanged out of obligation. But networking, done well, isn't about collecting contacts. It's about the specific language of genuine curiosity applied consistently over time. The single most powerful phrase in networking isn't, "Let me tell you about myself." It's, "Tell me about what you're working on." People remember, with surprising precision, how a conversation made them feel far more than what was said in it. And a conversation where they felt genuinely interesting to another person is one they'll want to continue. There's a specific follow-up skill that separates forgettable networking from opportunity-generating networking: the callback. Weeks or months after meeting someone, referencing a specific detail they mentioned, their kid's soccer tournament, a project they were nervous about, a book they recommended, signals that you were actually listening, not just performing politeness. How did that presentation to your board go? Lands entirely differently than "Great to see you again," because it proves the previous conversation actually mattered to you. Now let's talk about sales, a word that makes almost as many people wince as networking does, largely because most of us picture the pushy, script-reading stereotype rather than what effective selling actually looks like. Here's the truth. Sales, done ethically, is simply the skill of helping someone see clearly whether or not what you're offering solves their actual problem. The best salespeople talk far less than you'd expect. They ask precise questions about the problem. They listen for the real need underneath the stated one, and they only present their offer once they genuinely understand whether it fits. The phrase, "based on what you've told me," used honestly, right before describing how your offer addresses a specific thing the other person said, is disproportionately persuasive, precisely because it proves you were paying attention rather than reciting a script. Interviews deserve special attention here, because so much of interview performance comes down to a handful of specific language habits. The biggest one: replace vague claims with specific stories. "I'm a hard worker" is forgettable and unverifiable. Last year, I noticed our onboarding process was losing new clients in the first week, so I redesigned it and cut early cancellations by a third. Is a completely different kind of statement. Concrete, specific, and impossible to dismiss as generic self-promotion, because it's simply a fact you're reporting. Before any interview, prepare 3 or 4 of these specific stories in advance, each with a clear problem, action, and result, so you're never left improvising a vague answer under pressure. Negotiation is another arena where small language choices carry outsized weight. One of the most useful phrases in any negotiation is simply, "Help me understand how you arrived at that number." It's neither aggressive nor passive. It invites the other party to explain their reasoning, which often reveals flexibility they hadn't stated outright. And it does so without triggering the defensiveness that a flat, "that's too high," tends to produce. Another underused phrase, "What would make this work for both of us?" It reframes the conversation from a tug-of-war into a shared problem, which, even when the negotiation remains firm on substance, tends to produce far better outcomes than an adversarial tone ever could. For anyone building a business, this same principle scales up dramatically. Entrepreneurship, at its core, is largely the business of convincing people, customers, investors, employees, partners, to believe in something that doesn't fully exist yet. That belief is transmitted almost entirely through language. The way you describe the problem you're solving, the clarity with which you explain your solution, and the confidence with which you describe a future that hasn't happened yet. Founders who struggle to raise money or attract customers are very often struggling with a communication problem rather than a product problem. An idea that's genuinely strong, but explained in a way that fails to make its value obvious within the first 10 seconds of hearing about it. Here's an exercise worth doing, regardless of your current stage in business or career. Write a single sentence, under 20 words, that explains what you do and who it helps. The way Steve Jobs' team described the first iPhone in 3 plain phrases the entire world could repeat back instantly. Not your job title, not your industry jargon. A sentence a 12-year-old could understand and repeat to someone else accurately. This sentence will do more work opening doors for you than any resume, business card, or LinkedIn headline possibly could, because it's memorable, and memorable is what gets repeated to other people on your behalf when you're not even in the room. Relationships, professional and personal alike, deepen through a specific kind of language too. Appreciation spoken specifically rather than generically. Thanks for everything is pleasant but forgettable. Thank you for staying late to help me prep for that presentation. It made a real difference. Is specific enough to be remembered, and remembered appreciation is what turns a one-time favor into an ongoing relationship people are glad to keep investing in. Chapter takeaway: opportunity rarely announces itself. It's usually hiding inside an ordinary conversation, waiting for the right question, the right story, or the right specific thank you to bring it into view. Speak as though every conversation might be the one that matters, because you never quite know which one will be. Now let's zoom out and look at something bigger: the actual vocabulary patterns that separate people who consistently build wealth from people who consistently struggle to. Patterns you can start adopting today, regardless of your current income. Chapter 6: The Wealth Vocabulary. If you could sit quietly in the room during private conversations between highly successful entrepreneurs, not their public interviews, but their real, unscripted, working conversations, you'd notice something within the first 10 minutes that has nothing to do with intelligence, credentials, or luck. A distinct and consistent vocabulary. Not fancier words, different words, specific patterns of language that shape how they approach problems, setbacks, and decisions. The first and most fundamental pattern is what we might call possibility language versus limitation language. When a setback occurs, a deal falls through, a launch flops, a client walks away, limitation language reaches immediately for permanence and generality. This never works out for me. I always mess up the big opportunities. Nothing I try succeeds. Possibility language, by contrast, stays specific and temporary. That particular approach didn't work this time. I'm missing a piece of information here. What's one thing I'd do differently next time? The difference might look subtle on the page, but the psychological consequences are enormous. Limitation language turns a single event into a permanent identity. Possibility language keeps the event contained, isolated, and, critically, solvable. This connects to a concept researchers call explanatory style. Essentially, the habitual way we explain the causes of events to ourselves. People with an optimistic explanatory style tend to describe setbacks as temporary, specific, and external to their core identity. Not because they're naive or unrealistic, but because this framing keeps them functional and willing to try again. People with a pessimistic explanatory style tend to describe the exact same setbacks as permanent, pervasive, and deeply personal, a pattern strongly linked to giving up earlier and taking fewer of the calculated risks that success generally requires. The good news is that explanatory style is not fixed. It is, at its core, a language habit, and language habits can be retrained with deliberate practice. The exercise is straightforward, if not always easy. The next time something goes wrong, catch yourself before the first sentence of self-talk finishes forming, and ask, is this actually permanent, or is it temporary? Is this actually about everything, or is it about one specific thing? Is this really about who I am, or is it about what happened? Then consciously restate the setback using the more accurate, narrower version. This is not positive thinking for its own sake. It's accurate thinking, since most setbacks genuinely are more specific and temporary than our first emotional reaction makes them feel. A second wealth vocabulary pattern is abundance framing versus scarcity framing. Scarcity language treats resources, opportunities, and even relationships as a fixed pie. There's not enough business to go around. If I help a competitor, I lose. There's only room for one winner here. Abundance language, by contrast, recognizes that in most areas of modern economic life, value can genuinely be created rather than merely redistributed. There's room for multiple people to succeed here. Helping someone else doesn't cost me anything. New opportunities are being created faster than I can even track them. This isn't blind optimism. Plenty of situations genuinely are zero-sum, but defaulting to scarcity language when it isn't warranted quietly closes off collaborations, referrals, and partnerships that abundance-minded people routinely benefit from. A third pattern worth adopting deliberately: solution-focused language rather than problem-focused language. It's easy to spend an enormous amount of conversational energy elaborating on a problem, its causes, its unfairness, its history, without ever pivoting toward a solution. Solution-focused communicators acknowledge the problem briefly and honestly, and then move quickly toward the productive question, so what can we actually do about this? This single pivot phrase, so what can we do, is one of the most valuable sentences in the entire wealth vocabulary, because it redirects the energy of a conversation from complaint into contribution, and people are consistently drawn toward those who make that redirection easy. Leadership language deserves its own mention here, because leadership, at its core, is largely a communication function rather than a title. Leaders speak in terms of we more often than I when describing collective effort, and in terms of I rather than we when taking responsibility for a mistake, a small grammatical pattern that has an outsized effect on how much trust a team places in someone. Compare, we made an error in the rollout, and here's my plan to fix it, against, there were some issues with the rollout. The first sentence builds trust through ownership. The second quietly erodes it through vagueness and diffusion of responsibility. Finally, let's talk about specific limiting phrases worth retiring from the wealth vocabulary altogether, along with stronger alternatives to replace them. Instead of, I can't afford that, which shuts a mental door immediately, try, how could I afford that? A phrase which, remarkably, keeps your brain actively searching for a solution rather than confirming a dead end. Instead of, that's not realistic, try, what would need to be true for that to become realistic? Instead of, I don't have time, which is very rarely literally accurate. Try, that's not a priority for me right now. A phrase that's more honest, and that also forces you to actually confront whether your priorities are the ones you want them to be. Here's this chapter's exercise. Keep a small note, physical or digital, for the next week, and every time you catch yourself using scarcity or limitation language, write down the phrase, and beside it, write the abundance or possibility version. By the end of the week, you'll have a personalized dictionary of your own most common limiting phrases, and a ready replacement for each one. Chapter takeaway. Wealth-minded people are not necessarily smarter or luckier. They consistently use a specific vocabulary of possibility, ownership, and solutions, instead of limitation, blame, and problems. Change the vocabulary, and over time, you change the trajectory. Of course, not every conversation is easy, and not every setback is minor. Let's turn now to one of the most valuable communication skills of all: navigating the conversations that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Chapter 7. Mastering Difficult Conversations. There is a version of you that avoids difficult conversations, and there is a version of you that has them anyway, with grace and clarity. The difference between those two versions of you will, over a lifetime, account for a staggering share of the relationships you keep, the respect you're given, and the opportunities you're offered, because the willingness and ability to navigate conflict well is one of the rarest and most valued communication skills a person can develop. Let's start by naming why these conversations feel so hard in the first place. Our nervous systems evolved in an environment where social rejection could mean genuine physical danger, being cast out of the group that kept you fed and protected. That ancient wiring hasn't fully caught up with modern life, which means a tense conversation with your manager can trigger a physiological threat response nearly identical to genuine danger: a racing heart, tunnel vision, an urge to either attack or flee. Understanding this is useful because it means the discomfort you feel before a hard conversation is not a signal that something is wrong with you. It's an outdated alarm system, and it can be managed rather than obeyed. The single most useful reframe for any difficult conversation is this: separate the person from the problem. Nearly every unproductive conflict escalates because both parties start treating a specific, solvable issue as a referendum on someone's entire character. "You're always late" is a character accusation. "The last 3 deadlines slipped, and I want to understand what's happening" is a specific, solvable observation. The second version keeps the door open for problem solving. The first slams it shut because almost nobody responds to a character attack with curiosity. They respond with defensiveness. A structure worth memorizing here comes from conflict resolution research and is often called the Observation Impact Request Framework, though you don't need to remember the name, just the shape. First, state a specific, factual observation, without adjectives that imply judgment. The report was submitted 2 days after the deadline we agreed on. Second, state the actual impact, honestly and without exaggeration. That meant I had to rush my own review, and I was worried we'd miss the client meeting. Third, make a specific, forward-looking request. Going forward, can we agree on a check-in 2 days before each deadline, so I have time to flag if something's slipping? This structure works because it replaces vague blame with something concrete enough to actually act on. Receiving criticism well deserves just as much attention as delivering it, because how you respond to criticism shapes whether people feel safe giving it to you honestly in the future. And honest feedback, uncomfortable as it can be, is one of the most valuable things another person can offer you. The instinctive response to criticism is almost always defensive. An explanation, a justification, well, actually. A far more powerful first response, even when you disagree, is simply, "Thank you for telling me that. Let me think about it." This buys you time to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively, and it signals to the other person that their honesty was received rather than punished, which, over time, makes people far more willing to be honest with you again. There's a particular phrase worth having ready for moments of genuine disagreement. Help me understand your thinking here. It sounds simple, almost too simple, but it does real psychological work. It shifts the conversation from a battle of competing conclusions into a shared exploration of reasoning, which is a much easier place for two people to actually meet. Negotiating during emotional situations requires an additional layer of care. When emotions are running high, your own or the other person's, logic alone rarely lands, no matter how sound the argument. In these moments, acknowledging the emotion directly, before addressing the substance, tends to work far better than trying to reason your way past it. I can see this as really frustrating, is not a concession of your position. It's simply an accurate observation that clears enough emotional space for the actual substance of the conversation to be heard. It's also worth addressing a phrase that quietly sabotages more difficult conversations than almost any other. Calm down. Nearly universally, telling someone to calm down accomplishes the opposite, because it dismisses their emotion rather than acknowledging it, which tends to intensify rather than diffuse it. A far more effective alternative, when someone else is visibly upset, is simply to slow your own pace and lower your own volume. Emotional states are contagious in both directions, and a calm, steady voice does more to de-escalate a room than any instruction ever could. Finally, know when to pause a conversation rather than push through it. There is no shame, and often real wisdom, in saying, "I want to give this the attention it deserves. Can we pick this back up in an hour, once we've both had a chance to think?" This single sentence prevents an enormous number of conversations from escalating past the point of productive resolution, and it signals respect for the conversation's importance rather than avoidance of it. Here's this chapter's exercise. Think of one difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Write out, in advance, your observation, the impact, and your specific request, using the structure above. You don't have to have the conversation today, but having the words ready, in writing, removes an enormous amount of the anxiety that comes from not knowing how to begin. Chapter takeaway. Difficult conversations don't get easier by being avoided. They get easier by being practiced, with specific language that separates the person from the problem and turns conflict into collaboration. Now let's take everything we've built so far: clarity, confidence, influence, opportunity, wealth-minded vocabulary, and the courage to navigate conflict, and bring it together in the arena where communication carries the highest stakes of all: leadership. Chapter 8. Speak like a leader. Leadership is often described in terms of vision, decision-making, or charisma, as though it's some innate quality certain people are simply born with. But strip away the mystique, and leadership, in practice, is overwhelmingly a communication function. A leader is, quite literally, someone whose words other people choose to organize their own actions around. That's not a title given by an org chart. It's earned, sentence by sentence, through a specific and learnable set of language patterns. The first pattern is clarity of vision, expressed in language simple enough to spread on its own. Great leaders resist the temptation to sound impressive through complexity, because complicated language, however intelligent it sounds, is nearly impossible to repeat, remember, or rally behind. A leader who can compress a complex strategy into a single memorable sentence gives their entire team something they can carry into every decision they make, independently, without needing to ask permission first. If you can't yet explain your goal in one clear sentence, that's usually a sign the goal itself still needs more clarity, not that your audience needs more patience. The second pattern is storytelling, and it's worth understanding exactly why story works so much better than data alone at moving people to action. Human beings are wired to remember narrative far more durably than statistics. A single well-told story about one customer's experience will outlast a slide full of percentages in most listeners' memories by weeks or months. This doesn't mean data doesn't matter. It means data explains, but story motivates. The most effective leadership communication uses both: a story to make people care, and data to make people confident the plan is sound. A well-built leadership story tends to follow a simple shape: a relatable starting point, a specific obstacle, and a resolution that reveals the lesson or value being communicated. Notice that this doesn't require grand, dramatic material. Some of the most effective leadership stories are quiet and small. A single customer's frustration that led to a product change. A single team member's idea that solved a problem no one else had noticed. The size of the story matters far less than its specificity and its honesty. The third pattern is what we might call inclusive framing, the consistent, genuine use of we and us language when describing collective goals and challenges, reserving I primarily for personal accountability. This isn't a manipulative trick. It reflects something true about how sustainable leadership actually functions. The leader isn't separate from the team pursuing the goal. They're inside it, sharing both the effort and the outcome. Teams can tell, often within weeks, whether a leader's we language is genuine or performative, based entirely on whether that leader's actions match it. Showing up for the difficult parts of the work, not just the celebratory parts. The fourth pattern is decisiveness in language, particularly during uncertainty, which is, frankly, most of the time in any ambitious undertaking. This does not mean pretending to have certainty you don't actually have. False confidence collapses quickly once reality intrudes, and it damages trust badly when it does. It means being clear about what is known, honest about what isn't, and specific about the next concrete step regardless. We don't yet know how the market will respond, but here's exactly what we're doing in the next 2 weeks that, to find out, is a far more trust-building sentence than either false certainty or vague hesitation, because it gives people something solid to act on, even inside genuine uncertainty. Motivating a team through language also requires a specific kind of attentiveness, naming contributions specifically rather than generically. "Great job, everyone," is pleasant, but it's forgettable, and worse, it can feel hollow to the specific people who did the heaviest lifting. "The work you did untangling that vendor issue saved us 2 weeks. I want to make sure that doesn't go unnoticed," does something entirely different. It proves the leader was actually paying attention, and specific recognition like this is disproportionately powerful in building the kind of loyalty that generic praise never achieves. Public speaking, in whatever form it takes for you, a team meeting, a client pitch, a wedding toast, a town hall, deserves one final piece of language advice. Open with something other than an apology or a disclaimer. "Sorry, I'm not really a great public speaker," or "I didn't have much time to prepare this," does real damage before you've said a single substantive word, because it hands your audience permission to tune out before you've even begun. Open instead with the thing that matters most: a question, a short story, a striking fact, and let your credibility be built by the substance of what follows, not undermined by an apology nobody asked for. Here's this chapter's exercise. Think of one goal, for your team, your family, or yourself, and compress it into a single sentence under 15 words, simple enough that someone could repeat it accurately after hearing it once. Then think of one small, specific, true story that illustrates why that goal matters. Between the sentence and the story, you now have the 2 most important tools any leader ever needs to move people toward a shared future. Chapter takeaway: leadership is not a title. It's a communication pattern built from clarity, story, inclusive language, and decisiveness under uncertainty. Anyone, at any level, in any role, can begin speaking like a leader today. We've now covered the full arc, from the quiet words you say to yourself, all the way to the words that move entire teams. Let's bring it all together. Conclusion: becoming intentional with every word. Think back to the very beginning of this book. The image of every word leaving a visible mark on the world around you. By now, I hope that image feels less like a metaphor and more like a fairly literal description of how your life actually works. The walls and the paths are real. We just can't see them directly. We see their consequences instead, in the form of the relationships we build or lose, the opportunities we attract or repel, the confidence we cultivate or erode, one sentence at a time. Let's walk quickly back through everything we've covered, because the real power of these ideas comes not from understanding them individually, but from seeing how tightly they connect. It starts on the inside, with the conversation you have with yourself, the words that determine what you believe is possible before you ever open your mouth to anyone else. From there, we saw that vocabulary itself sharpens or dulls the resolution of your thinking, which means expanding your words is really expanding your capacity to solve problems. We looked at how your voice, its pace, its pitch, its willingness to drop the qualifiers, either broadcasts confidence or quietly undercuts it, and how a handful of physical adjustments can change that broadcast almost immediately. From there, we moved outward, to influence built on genuine listening and better questions rather than clever arguments, to the specific conversations, networking, sales, interviews, negotiations, where the right words turn ordinary encounters into real opportunity, to the wealth vocabulary that separates people who keep moving forward from people who stay stuck, one limiting phrase at a time, to the courage and structure required to navigate the difficult conversations most people spend a lifetime avoiding, and finally, to the leadership language that allows one person's words to organize the efforts of many. Here's what I want you to take from all of it. More than any single technique or exercise, none of this requires you to become a different person. It requires you to become a more intentional version of the person you already are. You don't need a bigger personality, a more commanding presence, or a talent for public speaking you weren't born with. You need to start noticing, really noticing, the words that are already leaving your mouth every single day, and to begin making small, deliberate choices about which ones deserve to keep leaving it. I want to leave you with a challenge, not a suggestion. For the next 30 days, choose one habit from this book. Just one, and commit to it completely. Maybe it's replacing "I can't afford that" with "How could I afford that?" Maybe it's asking 2 genuine questions before offering your opinion in every important conversation. Maybe it's simply catching the word "just" before it slips into another sentence where it doesn't belong. 30 days is enough time for a habit to start feeling less like an exercise and more like who you actually are. And here's the thing about compounding. Whether we're talking about money or about words, the early days rarely feel dramatic. 30 days of slightly more intentional language will not, on their own, transform your bank account or your career. But 30 days becomes 90, and 90 becomes a year, and somewhere in that stretch of time, quietly, almost invisibly, you become someone whose words people trust, whose questions people want to answer honestly, whose confidence isn't performed but genuinely felt, and whose opportunities start to feel less like luck and more like the natural result of how you've learned to speak. I'll leave you with one final thought, and I want you to carry it with you long after this book ends. Every conversation you have for the rest of your life is an opportunity, not to perform, not to impress, but to build something: trust, clarity, possibility, connection. Some of those conversations will feel enormous. A job interview, a difficult negotiation, a hard truth you need to speak to someone you love. Most of them will feel completely ordinary. A quick exchange with a stranger, a text message to a colleague, the quiet words you say to yourself while making your morning coffee. But ordinary conversations, repeated enough times, are exactly what a life is made of. So speak with intention. Speak with honesty. Speak in a way that builds rather than tears down, that opens doors rather than closes them, that installs belief where doubt used to live, starting with the belief you hold about yourself. Your words have always had this power. The only thing that changes today is that now you know it. This is where the real work begins, not in another chapter, but in your very next sentence.